our next session delegates, assisting people with disability to navigate the National Disability Insurance Scheme has become core business for many advocacy organisations. By working with the National Disability Insurance Agency has not always been easy. This frank and open conversation provides an opportunity for some straight talking and clear responses from the top to questions and concerns raised by the disability advocacy sector. I now introduce for the session called Plain Talking from the Top, Rick Morton, journalist and author, Vicki Rundall, Deputy CEO of the National Disability Insurance Agency, and Graeme Head, NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commissioner. Make our panellists welcome.
Excellent. My name's Rick Morton, as you just heard. Thank you, Wayne. Welcome to the Daru conference. It's a day for acronyms coming together. We've got the NDIA, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, the DARU, myself. Now all we need is the YMCA and we'll have a good time. Vicki, you're still the acting CEO of the NDIA. When are they going to find a new CEO, and is it going to be you?
I'm hoping it'll be quite soon, Rick. The process is still ongoing.
You can't give us any secret insights?
I can't.
Look, I've got some feedback from advocates from around the country about the top issues in the NDIS and in the quality and safeguarding kind of arena, and I just want to run through them with our guests, Graeme Head and Vicki Rundall. We'll try and keep the answers short and to the point if we can, just so we can get through all of the issues. I know there's a lot. We could talk for literally months, I think, about some of the stuff going on in the NDIS and still never finish all of the work. Graeme, I'll start with you. I think by now we can all agree that advocates are the one key thing that make the NDIS work. They get people access, they find the people that need help, and they help them get the help. The NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission ran a couple of forums at the end of June talking about the need for advocacy in the disability sector, both for people in the NDIS and people who don't make it into the NDIS. Does your commission have a role in promoting that advocacy through political channels, through the Department of Social Services, with reviews going on into the National Disability Advocacy Program? And if not, should there be a bigger role, given that they're critical to your work as well?
So thanks for that, Rick. And for those who weren't involved in those forums or aren't aware of them, before the Commission started up in 2018, we held our first forum with advocates in June 2018. And in June this year, before the 5 new states joined New South Wales and South Australia, we held a national forum for advocates, and that forum really looked at a couple of things, the key issues that advocates are facing, but also advocates' perspectives on the key quality and safeguarding issues in each jurisdiction. So the Commission's role is described in terms of our job to regulate quality and safeguarding, and the obligations on us to, wherever possible, involve people with disability in our work, but also to encourage and involve advocates. So to go to your question, we don't assume the role that DSS or the Departments of State have in respect of their programs that relate to advocacy, but I do think that over time, as the Commission matures, as we become, not just sort of focused on managing initial transition, but much more mature as an organisation, we will have more detailed insights into how we're working with advocates and the issues that people are raising. At the forum, I hope that's not me.
I think it is.
I'm the
Royal
person,
Commission into Graeme's mobile phone.
I'm the person who always barks at people in the cinema when their phone goes off. Sorry about that, everyone. So one of the things I announced at the forum was that we're about to establish our advisory structures with disability groups and advocacy organisations as well. So I think that, it's early days for the Commission. Yes, we're now operational in 7 of the 8 states and territories, but 5 of those have only been in the Commission's jurisdiction for about 9 weeks. The first 12 months was always going to be focused on managing what was a complex transition of roughly 20,000 providers and setting up all the national functions. So I think through our day-to-day handling of complaints, reportable incidents, etc., as well as those more kind of formal consultative mechanisms, we'll get sharper insights into how we're interacting with advocates, and that will allow us to share those insights with other government agencies.
Because presumably, just a quick follow-up, presumably there will be complaints and tip-offs, and you will find out information through advocates and not family members and not organisations. So they are a crucial part of your operation.
That's absolutely right. In fact, anyone can make a complaint to us, so advocates are extremely important, as are a whole range of other people who have contact with people with disability who are receiving supports, but already some of the complaint load we've been handling has been coming in from advocates.
So do you think there's a threat then to the well-oiled machine that you're trying to set up if disability advocacy organisations around Australia have their funding cut or they're struggling to survive? I mean, what existential threat does that offer to the way the NDIS and broader programs run?
Certainly a recognition in the quality and safeguarding framework and the way that was legislated that a strong advocacy capability is quite critical to strong quality work and safeguarding. So I do think, one of the things that is important for all of us to reflect on is that we've never had a national quality and safeguarding arrangement in this area before. And in fact, each of the arrangements that it's replacing in each state or territory looks quite different. So how advocacy works with the new arrangements is, like every other part of this, a work in progress. I do think that coming together through some of those formal consultative approaches is going to be pretty important for me to get insights around what the current pressures are and also how that affects our capacity to do our work.
At the same time, Vicki, I'll come to you now. At the same time that we've got probably the greatest workload ever for advocates around the country, we've got the NDIS having a few difficulties, I think you could say, with the way they do plan reviews and the way, if mistakes are made or there's something lost in translation between advocates and the person with disability and the planners, you can't just amend a plan and you've got to send it back and there's nothing interim there, which is causing huge delays, I think you could probably say. What are we doing to fix that? Because I think that's one of the key things that would drastically slash not only your workload, but the workload of people who aren't getting paid as much.
Yep. So thanks for that, Rick, and thank you also for asking us for today. Just a little bit of context before I go, if it's okay, sure, before I go to that particular question. So I think what we would all acknowledge is that the scheme, the first 3 years of trial with 30,000 people at the end of trial was small and it was a lot more bespoke. When we started to really scale up in transition and move to the numbers we have now, which is over 300,000 participants and 100,000 of those for the first time, which is wonderful, never had a support before, what we found is that a number of the things that we did, we were trying to build as we were trying to bring in large numbers of people. And so I think a lot of what we experience and participants and their families experience and others is that some of the design of the scheme we didn't design something sufficiently upfront. And in fact, we even over-engineered some things. I think we're now realising. So for example, assistive technology, we completely over-engineered that. And we're now starting to de-engineer that and simplify it so that we can get AT into plans much more quickly and require less onerous processes. And so that's true as well of plan reviews. So a lot of the reason you have plan reviews is because the drivers and the underlying root causes are those things. They are the complicated AT and home modification systems that we built. They're also, I think, to some extent, the way that we've approached the planning process, and we've got three, as people probably know, 3 areas in a plan: core supports, capacity building and capital. And then even within some of those, we've got particular line items which match our price catalogue. That's not where we want to be. The scheme was never envisaged to be like that. The scheme was envisaged really to work out what a reasonable package would be for an individual with a particular set of characteristics. And then the idea was to allow that participant and their family and others to be able to spend that money to be able to meet their needs and have a lot more flexibility.
And with those plans, you can't just bolt on an amendment after someone, if they realise they didn't get something they needed or they didn't speak up in the meeting. So you have to send it all the way back.
Yes, so back to that was your original question. So back to that, you're absolutely right that was the case. We're doing a few things now to fix that. We did bring into play late last year or mid last year what we call a light touch plan review, where we could make small amendments to the plan that didn't increase the plan value significantly. But what we really need to do, we're doing some ICT system improvements as well. This also brings into play the David Tune review of the Act, because we're looking to see whether there are any parts of the Act at the moment that are constructed such that they stop us from giving more flexibility to participants. So what we would like to be able to do is, for example, when we know that we do need a quote for something and we're hoping that we'll require a lot less, in fact we do require a lot less requirement for quotes now, for AT and home mods as an example, that we should be able to go, where we do require a quote, that once we get the quote we should be able to go straight in and amend that plan, but we have to make some system changes to do that, and possibly a little tweak to the Act, which is what we're looking at.
What part of the Act would need to change? I read the discussion paper, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
And look, I haven't got the Act with me, and
okay.
I'm really sorry. I actually can't pinpoint it for you right now either, but I could find out for you later. But the other thing that we're doing is we're making some other changes incrementally. So a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we made a change to the ICT system so that for some participants with fairly stable plans, the plan didn't expire for another 28 days, even when the expiry date was due. And that's got the ability to be further extended when we have trouble finding a participant, and we sometimes do have trouble locating participants and they don't come back to us when we contact them for a plan review, or if we're late and we haven't gotten to that participant yet, we're finding that the plan runs out, the plan bookings aren't extended, the money in the plan sort of ends, providers continue to provide in good faith services quite often, and then there is difficulty in them claiming for that. Now, last year we made a change to allow them to go back and back claim against that, so we had a little tweak in the ICT system to fix it. But this time what we'll do is everything will continue. The plan value will be prorated, the service bookings will be prorated, so the plan doesn't actually run out. And the Act allows us to do that because it actually does say that a plan remains in place until a new one is put in place. So we're thinking about whether we can extend that right across all plans, and that's probably our intention. And then possibly to get to a point where we don't have any expiry date at all and people have longer plan durations where they want them. But we're working through all of the policy aspects
just
of that.
Quickly, I'm conscious of the time. Just quickly, you mentioned system changes. A lot of this is the Department of Human Services IT infrastructure that was brought across, as I understand it, brought across and it was never really fit for purpose. Is that going to change wholesale, or do we have to tinker with that system and turn it into something that works?
It's a good question. The system is built on a CRM SAP. The system is a customer relationship management system built on a SAP base. I'm not an ICT expert, but I think most people know that what I hear is that SAP is a very unforgiving, doesn't allow you to do too much to make it bespoke. So it's pretty reliable on the basic things, but not on some of the others. And what we've now reached an agreement with Department of Human Services, who have been very good, by the way. They've been really responsive. We've reached an agreement where Where we need some add-ons and some enhancements that are complementary to the SAP base, we can get them from elsewhere. And so we're starting to do that now with our appointment booking system, our complaints system, and some other things we're looking at. And then over time, we are looking to see whether or not there's a better system. We're doing some more work on our portals, both portals, and we'll be working closely with participants and providers shortly on both portals.
Thank you so much. Graeme, we're now on to the third, we're well into the full rollout of the NDIS, the transition. We've got a lot of inquiries underway. We've got a Royal Commission into Disability Abuse. We've heard story after story after story of horrible abuse, in some cases death, that have really resulted in nothing particularly punitive on the providers. In some cases of harm, they've just been given a notice to take action. And it reminds me of the aged care sector. I mean, for so long, the aged care watchdog simply gave providers notices to improve things, even where they committed quite serious harm, and then just moved on and hoped they got better. I understand that's not the practice you're taking with the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, and how can we reassure people and advocates and people and their families that action will be taken? They can get justice if they come and complain, and that something will change because of it.
Thanks for that, Rick. Most of the people in this room would know that when governments decided to purpose-build a quality and safeguarding framework for the NDIS, that they undertook a pretty comprehensive process to develop that, a lot of consultation, large numbers of workshops, submissions, etc. So what we've ended up with in the NDIS is something that's purpose-built for this, and that contains, I think, a very, very broad and strong set of compliance and enforcement provisions. So the Commission regulates all providers in the sector, registered and unregistered. It regulates registered providers through the registration process, so that requires them to be assessed against practice standards with which they have to conform.
Can I just quickly clarify that? So you can be, everyone here probably knows this, but just in case, you can be an unregistered provider for somebody who's self-managing their plan, but you're still regulated.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll explain how that works. So if you're registered, you have to go through an audit process. You have conditions of registration which require you to comply with the Code of Conduct, to do a whole range of things, and we can take action if you breach the conditions of your registration, or a provider does. For self-managing participants who are choosing, some of them, to use unregistered providers are still code-covered people, so subject to regulation. The code has teeth, so I can ban unregistered providers. I can take a large range of regulatory action against both registered and unregistered. The thing about the enforcement provisions are that they provide a basis for what's usually described as proportionate action, which means that if the ideal outcome is that somebody is directed to improve, then we can do that. But if the nature of the problem is more serious and requires a different kind of regulatory intervention, then there's a whole range of tools under the Act. I can seek an injunction from a court, I can seek enforceable undertakings from a court, I can issue infringement notices, I can revoke a registration, suspend one.
Infringement notices are fines.
Yeah, fines.
Yep.
And I can ban providers from the market, and I think...
How many have you banned?
About a dozen so far. So very, very strong powers in this new purpose-built set of regulatory arrangements, and they differ often quite a lot from what was in place in a given state or territory before the changeover happened. Our focus, as I said earlier, in the first 12 months was migrating the 20,000 registered providers in, getting all the systems working, but we have already quite strong levels of activity in compliance and enforcement, with investigations underway, with compliance notices issued. So in addition to fining somebody, I could issue you, if you're a registered provider, with a compliance notice which says you either have to do these things or you have to stop doing these things. And if somebody didn't comply with that notice, that's then the basis for taking stronger action. In addition, of course, we're now receiving reports of reportable incidents which are codified in the Act from all 7 of the 8 jurisdictions that are in so far. So that gives us an insight into some of the more serious problems.
So, I mean, if you compared it to the aged care, I know you went to the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety, compared to what they have done in the past and even what they do now with their new commission, it strikes me that your powers are far greater. In your own words, is that...
I'm not an expert on the aged care system, but I think generally the view is that the powers that the NDIS Commission have been given some of the strongest powers that have operated in a kind of human services space. I'm not an expert on what's in the Aged Care Act, but I certainly feel, as somebody who's regulated in a number of different environments, that it's a very, very comprehensive regulatory toolkit to be able to take strong action where it's needed.
Yeah. Vicki, let's talk about the early childhood, early intervention and the NDIS. Now, there's been quite large backlogs, I guess, in getting kids into the scheme. You've had much higher the number of children approaching and getting into the scheme. I know the changes are afoot and you're trying to do stuff to streamline that process, but people are reporting that there are still backlogs, there are still no clear timelines about when and how things will change, and that providers are actually having to lay off staff because there's no cash flow. How do we fix this? What's going on?
Well, firstly, just acknowledge that you're absolutely right. There have been backlogs, partly due because of the large numbers of children coming into the scheme. And as you said, Rick, in the last quarter was over 7,000 children, 0 to 6 years, that came either into the gateway.
That's the highest it's been ever in the NDIS?
In the highest quarter ever.
Highest quarter.
Yeah, for that age group. So that, combined with the rollout of the ECI partners and the fact that some are at greater levels of maturity than others, has meant that there have been real pressures on the ECI providers. We recognised this earlier in the year, even before, but particularly earlier in the year, we started doing some early work with the providers to assist them. Then the Minister announced in June, and people may have seen this, a range of initiatives to try and reduce the backlog, which were temporary initiatives with the aim to reducing the backlog by the end of the year within reasonable timeframes. So to answer the question about how long do people have to wait, the children should not have to wait to get a plan between, if they have to wait more than 50 days between getting access and getting a plan, then they will get access to this interim plan that the Minister announced with interim funding so that they can get early supports. We've also allowed providers to subcontract to get some additional help where they can't provide all of those services. They'll also benefit from the increase in therapy prices that we announced recently, which were considerable. So we also have pushed in some of our own early childhood experts into some of those providers, and we noticed that across the country, the areas that are currently most acute are Victoria, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia, and so we're particularly focusing there. So in answer to people's question about how long do they have to wait, we're confident we will have the backlog cleared at least, if not earlier, by the end of this year. The other thing is that there will be timeframes, and there are already, that ECI providers have to meet in their contract, and this is likely to be also picked up by the David Tune review in the Participant Service Guarantee. And finally, on providers, wherever we know that a provider is struggling, we will always make contact and try and understand what the reasons are. But what we hadn't... I haven't become aware of any ECI, unlike a partner who is different because we contract partners and pay for them. For a provider of early childhood supports, nothing has been brought to my attention recently, but wherever we even think there's a risk, we will make contact with those providers.
Just broadly, I mean, I know that this is one particular issue, but I mean, across, we're talking about delays and backlogs and things like that. I know people keep bringing up staff. Do you have enough staff at the agency to do the job at the moment?
We do. We've been rolling out the participant pathway and the early childhood part of that. We're still continuing to roll out a few more early childhood specialists
but it's been a struggle,
planners.
hasn't it?
Yes, it has been, but it's partly a consequence of just growing the scheme. And you've heard the analogy, flying the plane while you're building it.
I remember that report very well.
It's sort of a bit like that. We've been.
But some of those staff early on were meant to be in the agency, and they were thrown out essentially, and contracted and made partners rather than being on a team that has consistency and access. Has that not contributed to some of the problems that we've had?
Well, it depends which way you look at it, you see, because you could implant those people inside the agency. Alternatively, these are people that are really well embedded in their community. So all of the early childhood partners, the LACs, all of the non-government organisations, they are so closely enmeshed with their local communities and the families that use the supports that I think that you get much more benefit from leveraging off on those networks that those community organisations have. And I think it's the same for early childhood specialists.
I'm just going to stick with you for a bit. There's been a lot of concern about the emphasis in the NDIS about families providing informal care and support. It seems to go against the grain when we obviously wanted people to be given the support funded as they needed it so they could live their lives independently and not have to rely on their families. What's happening in that space? Have we got the balance right between wanting people to have access to their family and informal community participation and things like that versus actually making sure they have funded plans that don't force them to rely on their family?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the first thing I should say is that the role of families and carers and others in a participant's life is critical and very well recognised by us and the value that brings. But to answer your question, I'll go back to the original PC report in 2011. The Productivity Commission estimated that I think it was I had it here, Rick, just a little while ago to talk to you about. That's right. That if there only needed to be a 3.4% increase of carers and families in the workforce as a consequence of the NDIS to get a 1.5% increase in GDP. In the last quarterly report, the percentage of carers where employment had increased because they felt they had sufficient support inside the family home and they could go out and work, increased to, it was 3.2% increase in 1 year. And that's for parents and carers of kids between the ages of 0 to 14. For participants who are aged 15 to 24%, that was a 3.2% increase, and it was flat for over 25s.
That's a good news story.
It is. It's fantastic. And we also found that the number of working hours increased for people over the hours of 30 hours a week. And so we need to do a whole lot more. Now, in terms of what we provide, we do provide a range of supports for family. I said to you earlier, we haven't been calling it respite. We call it other things like short-term accommodation and core supports overnight and capacity building, employment supports for a young person or an adult so that parents can be confident that they don't need to be there all the time and that their loved one is able to prosper and do something that they want to do. But we've just started to change our language because we realise that most people relate to the word respite, and so we're going to be looking at our guidelines and making that clearer and what supports are put into plans.
I think we're out of time. I'm going to be doing a quick interview afterwards with Vicki for the social media stuff, so there's a couple of questions I didn't get to that I will ask, and so you can see that on the hashtag and on Twitter if you're so inclined, but my advice, as always, is stay off Twitter, never tweet. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Graeme, so much for coming and giving your time.
Some plain talking from the top delegates. Can I join me again in thanking Rick, Vicki and Graeme? It's wonderful, Rick, Vicki and Graeme, to have the leaders of organisations that are so important to people with disability and our advocates here with us today. So thank you for sharing your time. Delegates, I have now steered us ever so confidently, reassuringly, to lunch. It is lunchtime. It is networking time. Over lunch, we will be enjoying food together, networking together, chatting together, tweeting together. I haven't seen me appear on Twitter yet or on Instagram. Why am I not trending? But we are indeed. Let's keep the conversation going. We shall reconvene at 1:30. See you then.